Shakespeare and his writing style. State Standard HS1.T.CR2.B. Examine and justify original ideas and artistic choices in a theatrical work based on critical analysis, background knowledge, and/or historical and cultural context. Cross-curricular State Standard ELA-literacy.RL.9 through 10.5. Analyze how an author's choices concerning how to structure a text create effects within it. Shakespeare's plays are written in a combination of two kinds of writing known as verse, which can also be called poetry, and prose. Verse, also known as poetry, means that the words are arranged on the page in lines according to a certain number of syllables. You will start a new line every time you max out your syllables depending on your meter. Meter is a poetry term that refers to, first, how many syllables go in each line and what the pattern of emphasis for those syllables should be. Prose, on the other hand, refers to the way people talk every day. I'm speaking in prose right now. You speak in prose when you talk to your friends. When you write an essay, you're writing in prose. When you write a short story, you're writing in prose. Prose follows standard grammar rules. Paragraphs are indented. You continue writing until you reach a margin and then start a new line. You don't have a specific emphasis pattern that you have to follow, but you do begin every sentence with a capital letter and end with a punctuation mark. That's prose. What you're looking at is an example of verse, what it looks like and what it sounds like. This is one of Ophelia's monologues from the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, and when I say it out loud, it sounds like this. Oh, what a noble mind is here o'erthrown! The courtiers, scholars, soldiers, eye, tongue, sword, the expectancy and rose of the fair state, the glass of fashion and the mold of form, the observed of all observers, quite down, and I of ladies most deject and wretched, that sucked the honey of his music vows, now see that noble and most sovereign reason, like sweet bells jangled out of tune and harsh, that unmatched form and feature of blown youth, blasted with ecstasy, oh woe is me, t'have seen what I have seen, see what I see. When you look at it on the page or on the screen, you'll notice that the lines of text do not continue all the way across the page or the screen, but they stop once the line has reached a certain number of syllables. Every line begins with a capital letter and either ends with a punctuation mark or a comma indicating that a thought is not yet complete and will continue on to the next line. When you listen to a passage in verse, you should hear a rhythm. Even if you're not 100% sure what that rhythm is, you should hear that there is a pattern of loud and soft syllables that happen at about the same pace, almost like downbeats of a drum in a piece of music. Shakespeare used verse, and he used a certain verse called iambic pentameter or blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter, primarily because everyone else was doing it. It was common practice in Shakespeare's time to write plays using blank verse because the way they had learned to speak Greek and Latin at school, which were the two languages that they would have been most likely to study at school, were Greek and Latin. The way that they learned those languages was by reading ancient Greek and Roman plays. And so the playwrights of the time used blank verse because that's what the ancient Greeks had used. They learned about it at school and they thought that that was the way it was supposed to be done. So Shakespeare uses iambic pentameter, specifically blank verse iambic pentameter, because that's what everybody else was doing. However, Shakespeare excels above his contemporaries because he harnesses the blank verse. He harnesses the iambic pentameter and uses it to convey information to his actors about who his characters are and what they're thinking and feeling. One of the ways that Shakespeare uses verse is to tell us about a character's social status. If a character is speaking in verse all the time or almost all of the time, we, the actors, know that our characters are wealthy or they're of the noble classes. Remember, a nobleman is someone who has a title, and that title gives them authority over a piece of real estate, a big piece of property. And that's going to affect the way I move my body. If my character is a king, I'm going to move differently than if my character is a beggar on the street. I need to know that information as an actor to play my part properly. Shakespeare also uses the verse to tell us about a character's emotional state. There are characters in Shakespeare who speak primarily in prose, and sometimes they'll suddenly start breaking out into some verse. That's a good indicator that these characters have fallen in love. If a verse character, somebody who speaks in verse all the time, suddenly starts rhyming, that's a good indicator that they have fallen in love. Remember, blank verse is unrhymed iambic pentameter. So when these characters who speak verse all the time start rhyming, that's falling in love. If you've got a character who speaks in verse all of the time and the verse starts to mess up, maybe the pattern of emphasis begins to shift around, or there are too many or too few syllables, that's a clue that those characters are upset about something. Maybe they're angry or sad, or a lot of times it's because they're losing their mind. Shakespeare likes to work with characters who are in varying stages of sanity. And so as a character declines into madness, into insanity, a lot of times you will see them slowly devolve into more and more prose and less verse. Regardless, the verse is something an actor has to understand because Shakespeare uses the verse to give actors clues about how to play their parts. In other words, when the verse breaks, it's not Shakespeare making a mistake, and it's not you, the student, just not understanding iambic pentameter. You're picking up on Shakespeare himself trying to give you some acting tips. Here on this screen, we have an example of what prose would look like on the page. I'm going to read this out for you so that you can hear prose as well. This is a dialogue between two characters. Despite the fact that both of them are upper-class characters, they are both speaking entirely in prose. I'm only going to do the first speech for the sake of time. Sounds like this. That a woman conceived me, I thank her. That she brought me up, I likewise give her most humble thanks. But that I will have a hunting call winded in my forehead, or hang my bugle in an invisible sheath, all women shall pardon me. Because I will not do them the wrong to mistrust any, I will do myself the right to trust none. And the fine is, for which I may go the finer, I will live a bachelor. When you hear prose, first, you'll probably notice that it's a little bit faster than verse because I'm not stopping for a breath at the end of every line. Some actors say that you have to breathe at the end of every line of verse and some don't. That's debatable. But with prose, you only take a breath where the punctuation would normally tell you to. A small breath at a comma, a bigger breath at a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point, just like we would do speaking anything written in prose today. You'll also notice that there is no particular emphasis pattern. There's no rhythm that is popping up in my ear. There's no drum beat that is driving this speech. There is no pattern of strong or weak syllables that create any kind of musicality or poetic quality to this speech. It's just a guy talking about the fact that he doesn't hate women and he's real grateful to his mama for bringing him into this world, but he doesn't ever want to get married because women kind of suck. When you look at it on the page, you'll notice that it doesn't stop every X number of syllables. It just continues on until the text reaches a margin, and then it starts a new line. But that new line doesn't have a capital letter at the beginning, and there's no punctuation at the end of a line unless it happens to be where a punctuation would naturally occur. So this text is following our standard rules of grammar. Shakespeare also harnesses the prose, but in a different way than he does verse. This tells us about a character's social status. When a character is speaking almost entirely in prose, they're either middle or lower class. They're working folks. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have titles. They don't have property. They don't have authority to rule over anybody else. Shakespeare can also use prose to indicate to an actor that a line they are saying is supposed to be a joke, especially if it's a vulgar or dirty joke. So when a verse character starts to speak in prose, many times they are making a reference to some sort of crude humor. If we'd kept reading the passage that was the conversation between Benedict and Don Pedro, there are some jokes related to male genitalia that I'm not going to point out to you, but if you would like to go back and take another look at that passage and see if you can figure out where the dirty jokes about male genitalia happen to be, then I can't stop you. Of course, these jokes don't always have to be dirty. Characters that speak in prose all of the time in most of Shakespeare plays are comic relief, or they're supposed to be humorous characters. So the jokes don't necessarily have to be dirty jokes. But when a verse character breaks into prose to tell a joke, that's a pretty strong indicator that the joke is crude or vulgar or dirty. However, characters aren't just joking when they're speaking in prose. Sometimes Shakespeare uses prose just to make the dialogue more realistic. There are short functional responses all through Shakespeare where verse characters say things like, "I will, my lord," or "I pray you leave." And these are written in prose. They're not enough syllables to fit the meter of iambic pentameter. They don't follow a certain metric or emphasis pattern. And they're left in prose form because that's how people would naturally respond. Shakespeare wasn't so highfalutin that he felt like every single line of every single play had to be in perfect iambic pentameter. In fact, he breaks it on purpose many, many times. And as I've mentioned before, he also uses prose to help us follow a character's mental decline. If you have a verse character, or at least a character who begins the play speaking primarily verse, that slowly starts to use more and more prose, either they are losing their political power or they're losing their mind and going crazy. We see this, an excellent example of this in the play King Lear. King Lear is the title character. He is the king, and he begins the play speaking entirely in verse. He loses his mind over the course of the play and goes crazy. By the end, he's speaking entirely in prose, and you see that character's mental decline if you are able to watch for the shifts from verse to prose throughout the play. Hamlet, that play has a similar method where Hamlet begins speaking entirely in verse, and slowly over the course of the play, Hamlet himself, who is a prince, uses more and more prose as he's sort of driven into desperation and a deep, deep depression, almost to the point of madness, by the situation that he finds himself in. Othello is another one. Othello is a character who's driven mad by jealousy.